So, Giles, while we are waiting for the people to join, how's the weather? How's the weather back in the UK?
It's really sunny, which is quite surprising actually, and so hopefully that kind of stays that way for the rest of the summer. But as you know, British weather is quite unpredictable, so we don't really
Yes.
know what to expect. And I guess the same
Yeah.
goes for our upcoming elections on the 4th of
y-
July. So everyone is very preoccupied with that topic as well at the moment.
Yes, exactly. There's a butterfly effect everywhere, I think.
That's indeed the case. Yes.
Exactly. Okay. I think by now most of the people will have joined. So let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this new webinar, this time with Giles Spungin. Giles has been working for over 15 years in various leadership roles in MRM at Deutsche, Goldman Sachs, HSBC, and more recently at Lloyds, as he has firsthand experience in how this landscape of model risk management has changed over time. He's the perfect guest, I think, to talk about the evolution of model risk management. So, welcome, Giles, and thanks for joining this webinar.
Thanks,
So
Joe. It's
let's
good to be here.
yeah, let's definitely get started right away. So, if you look back at all the experience you have built up over these last 15 years, how have you seen model risk management evolve?
So that's a really interesting question. So clearly, MRM or model risk management as a topic um, what was raised in um, I guess importance after the last global financial crisis, and we did see a few examples where misbehaving models and decisions made based on bad models led to quite significant regulatory censure as well as reputational risk and cost of capital going up and so forth. So we have seen recognition of the importance of models and model risk, and clearly that is still the case. So financial institutions and other organizations are very aware of MRM. Clearly, the challenge now is that we are in the age of AI, and the importance of model risk management is becoming even more um, profound. And I think this is what we need to do, not just as a kind of risk practitioners, but also as a financial industry, to recognize these risks. Number one, the evolving nature of these risks, and number two, to respond to them in a meaningful way. It doesn't mean kind of start introducing a significant number of regulation controls. It's about how to strike the right balance between deploying AI and models more generally in a safe and responsible manner, but at the same time doing it in a way which is sustainable.
Yes, exactly. And to your point, so indeed, we've seen this gradual shift from, say, classical models no more to more AI, and now most recently generative AI. So I imagine that this must also have an impact on the teams who are involved in model risk management and AI risk management. Could you maybe comment a little bit on that? Like, how do teams change over time?
Yes, that's a really important point because ultimately it's all about people. It's all about how do we internalize some of the things that we learn from our past experiences related to models as well as regulatory uh, guidance and requirements. So one of the stark examples that I can think of is how models, and in addition to the classical kind of regression-based models, now clearly that would include all kind of advanced um, AI use cases, generative, unsupervised as well as supervised. Um, through rapid digitization of financial services and introduction of cloud computing, etc., data became ubiquitous, and AI and model risk became ubiquitous as well. Which means that in the past you could almost kind of isolate or identify a particular team that would be responsible for model risk management. Whereas now, because models are everywhere, data are everywhere, compute is everywhere, or computation capabilities are everywhere, it effectively becomes everyone's job. And as a result, that absolutely has an impact on your skill set profile. So as an example, before MRM was something that modelers were really interested in, and rightly so, as well as the business that were responsible for deploying those models. And this is kind of the old world. Nowadays, again, AI is everywhere, data is everywhere. A significant proportion of model risk comes from third parties. So now all of a sudden we need to start recognizing the importance of vendor and third party risks, and how do we embed that into procurement processes, as well as our legal frameworks, for example. But also clearly when it comes to productionization of models, we need to start thinking about implications on IT department and technology, and how do we actually make it work in a sustainable manner. And then we need to start clearly thinking about how skill set profile needs to evolve, so that we have people who recognize some of the IT implications, as well as regulatory, procurement, third party, etc. So essentially what it means is that the skill set profile of individuals that are expected to work and action model risk management is becoming quite broad. And as a result, you're almost looking at individuals who are or who are expected to have those unicorn skill sets that are jacks of all trade, but also they are expected to do a really good job at all these dimensions. And it is clearly a really big challenge. In addition to that, clearly, to my earlier point, given the fact that model risk management and models, in addition to AI, becoming kind of ubiquitous, we have a growing need to have C-level executives being not just aware of model risk management, but also having capacity and time to actually understand some of those risks. And this becomes a really big challenge. More specifically, to how do we find individuals with the right skill set who can, on one hand, manage some of those model risk management topics day to day, but on the other hand, these individuals should also be in position to communicate these really technical problems in a way which is easy to understand and act on by more senior C-level executives. And this is another, I guess, kind of dimension to our skill set profile challenge that we're seeing now.
Yes, indeed, plenty of things to think about with respect to, say, the teams themselves, like the typical AI teams. Do you expect that the same challenges exist both for first line, so basically the teams who build the models, and then second line, which is a bit closer to, say, risk management, the teams who review independently if the models work? And if so, have you seen, for instance, that multidisciplinary teams work well in those contexts? Because to your point, having a team of unicorns with these huge skill sets is rather hard to set up, right? So what are, say, techniques that you have seen working in practice to deal with this?
Yes, so clearly, we are, as a financial industry, we are expected to have a kind of three line of defense framework, which means that we are expected to have a clear delineation between the first line and the second line. More specifically, a team in the business, for example, who are responsible for development of these models, and also these teams would own the risk. And then you have your second line, third line functions that are responsible for oversight and making sure that all the guardrails are there for the business and the first line, more specifically, to follow. What we have seen in the past is that clearly, because the first line, I'm going to use kind of the regulatory language here, because the first line are responsible for, inverted commas, the doing, then those individuals clearly will be more technically minded, and they will be much closer to the detail. Whereas in the past, and that's before the financial crisis, kind of the second and third lines, they were generalists who were willing to talk about more technical topics, but they wouldn't necessarily have a full understanding of the depth of some of these complexities. And coincidentally, that's how I kind of got into model risk. So after financial crisis, actually, I saw an opportunity to actually introduce some more technical rigor into some of those functions, and that's essentially what I have seen um, effectively been taken up by the industry as a whole, and now we have a recognition that uh, functions, second line, third line functions have to have that technical capability, almost to the same level of expertise as the first line. So what can we do to make that happen? Because clearly we're not yet where we need to be, and there's a lot of work to be done in that space. Number one, we have seen a lot of job sharing, for example, which means that we give opportunities to people in the first line, more technical individuals, almost going to experience more risk management from the lens of second and third line. And also it helps with nurturing that risk awareness culture rather than just let's get this thing done mindset. But also similarly, those job shares also work for the kind of second and third line, those individuals and the functions, spending some time with the business, trying to effectively live and breathe some of the day-to-day challenges that those individuals experience, as well as get up to speed with some of the technical notions. So that's one piece. Another piece, and that's again kind of to my point earlier that model risk is everywhere. We have seen increasingly second and third line functions actively utilizing and deploying their own model capabilities, not just to manage model risk, but to undertake their day-to-day activities. And that naturally gives rise to employment opportunities and kind of skill set requirements, something that we spoke about a minute ago, in those second and third line functions, which means that now we have genuine demand for those more technical minded individuals to actually kind of find themselves in kind of non-business areas. But that kind of cross-pollination and kind of the kind of risk mindset is still really important, which I guess is a kind of a component of that kind of technical capability that we spoke about earlier.
Yes, exactly. And another topic in that context is something that we discussed a few weeks ago together with David Ashby when we were talking about the AI Act, which is upcoming regulation and specifically for AI. We were talking about, say, first of all, the technical nature of some of those rules. In the end, many of the requirements from the regulation are actually almost like good engineering practices, right? If you have a senior team who's seriously building a high risk use case, then you would expect them to do some testing and to do some documentation and to try to understand what are the limits of the system as they build it. But what he mentioned was that one of the, say, new aspects were a little bit more related to, say, the ethics, like thinking about what does it mean for a model to be fair. And it's not so much the mathematical nature that is problematic. It's more defining as an organization what you will call fair or unfair or biased. So do you also see an angle for that type of capabilities to develop in those teams?
Absolutely, and that's something that we kind of briefly alluded to when we said that model risk now is everyone's job, and briefly talked about kind of legal teams are now getting increasingly involved in those kind of AI conversations as well as compliance functions and risks functions, etc. So, and this is exactly right. So clearly, fairness is a relatively new concept in this kind of model risk management paradigm, something that we need to start paying great attention to. But at the same time, I think we are kind of getting into the territory where some of these topics will be not just for the MRM practitioners to define, right? So what can be fair in one person's or team's view may be completely unfair in another. So and this I think is a good example where that's kind of first of all kind of communication of these problems to the senior leadership, and then provision of assistance to effectively find the right outcome and help those decision makers to kind of get the right decision on the back of this is quite important. But also, it's a good example where I think industry as a whole should work really closely together, not just with regulators, but also kind of across to make sure that we're consistent, because clearly consistency is quite important. You don't want to leave things up for debate and up for interpretation, because that's when you start getting into kind of uncharted territory. So that consistency becomes important, but also the kind of overall agreement of where we need to draw those red lines. I think it's quite fundamental as well.
Yes, exactly. And so to your earlier point, so the skill set gets broader, the the topics get much more wide. So it's not only purely technical model risk management capabilities anymore. You need to think about legal implications, about ethical implications. And then if we then think of, say, the impact on technology, when we used like back in the days, probably a good model inventory could already be implemented using an Excel file, basically, as it's primarily a list of models. These days, with AI use cases that are running on a fairly large amount of different infrastructures, with dependencies between them, with data that is flowing from one component to the other, I would imagine that there is quite an important impact on technology as well. So can you maybe comment on that? How have you seen these technology requirements evolve over time?
Yes, that so technology clearly becomes a really important ingredient. Clearly, technology is an enabler, and technology considerations should absolutely be part of your not just kind of model design, development, deployment, but also MRM, model risk management as an activity going forward. And also to complicate things further, now clearly we started seeing AI and models being embedded on silicon, which means that you almost kind of blur the line between model risk management and technology risk, for example, as well as cybersecurity risk and so forth. Some of the things that were historically very far from model risk management. So again, we're seeing these topics not just kind of getting closer to each other, but in certain cases almost kind of morphing. So that clearly becomes quite a big problem, not just from the skill set perspective that we have already touched on, but also from the kind of risk oversight perspective. So as a financial institution, so how do I design my risk management framework, which clearly MRM is a subset of, to make sure that I have all the necessary touch points across different risk disciplines so that I can produce that read across and get a holistic view of my risk landscape overall. Hence, that will then drive your risk appetite statements and so forth. And that becomes a quite an important problem that's quite a number of financial institutions, including quite sizable financial institutions, have only recently started to recognize. Um, so that clearly will have an impact on your skill set profile. But also from the point of view of technology, so kind of putting aside kind of the awareness and the recognition of that emerging broader risk landscape, technology is absolutely super important for your kind of development and deployment of models, as well as it's a really important enabler in your model risk management activities as well. And also, there is a unique opportunity for us to use technology as almost a kind of a preventative control capability, which means that once we almost kind of digitize our understanding of the risk and what we need to do to manage those model risks effectively, I see technology as a key enabler that will effectively help us to manage model risk going forward. Um, and that's something that, again, number of financial institutions only starting to recognize. Um, some of the big cloud providers, clearly, we have seen introduction of things like MLOps, but again, it doesn't go kind of broad enough to kind of cover the entirety of model risk management. But I guess the point is that the capability are certainly there, and we need to kind of develop and enhance these further.
Indeed, and when you mention preventative controls, I assume that what you mean is that you want to somehow use technology in such a way that models can only reach production basically whenever they have been vetted by the right team, whenever the right approvals have been have been put in place. And this is indeed something that you could achieve, for instance, by integrating, say, a deployment pipeline with a model risk management system to perform those checks. Is this what you have in mind, or did you have?
That's exactly right. So you essentially have a number of controls, checks and balances that you have embedded in your process, and clearly utilize technology as part of that process. When you develop a model, you source the data, you analyze and extract useful features from your data. So that clearly requires technology. But those preventive controls are effectively embedded checks and balances into your process, that essentially help you to stay on track and stay within a particular safety guardrails. So this is one aspect of preventive controls. They effectively prevent you from making a mistake. Let's put it that way. But also, preventive controls are there to help to stop the harm ultimately. So let me kind of draw a relatively kind of simple analogy, which I find quite useful when I communicate this topic to senior decision makers and C-level execs. So, electricity. So electricity is ubiquitous, and we've seen the use of electricity skyrocket, from late 1800s. Um, and a really simple example of preventive control in that space would be a circuit breaker, right? So your electricity flow stops before that electric current has an opportunity to kill someone. And this is a good example where we have a almost kind of embedded control into your process. In the simple analogy, it's distribution of electricity, which is there just in case. And if something goes wrong, it's there to act without a kind of necessary intervention, manual intervention. Hence, we kind of stop the risk from crystallizing. And look, these examples are not novel, not new for AI. So, for example, a decade ago, I was involved in design and development of controls for algorithmic trading. And we were talking about circuit breakers, we were talking about human in the loop and all these things. And clearly, kind of the angle there was that these algo systems were so fast in making decisions, humans were not quick enough to respond to some of those decisions. Hence, we started introducing those preventive controls. Nowadays, clearly, you can argue that AI has same challenges, hence the importance of those preventive controls. But also, I guess, with AI, something that we didn't see in algorithmic trading is, we have a new dimension of complexity, and is that, self-learning, unsupervised learning, where systems can effectively evolve by themselves without human interaction, clearly creates an additional kind of complexity when it comes to managing risks associated with all that. So I guess, some of the lessons learned that we've seen from algorithmic trading can be applied to AI when it comes to design and development of those preventive controls, but we shouldn't stop there because, again, as I said, kind of the risks are evolving.
And you mentioned humans in the loop. Um, do you have in mind specific strategies to make human in the loop work efficiently? And I clarify a little bit. So, for instance, suppose that you build a Gen AI application that is summarizing text, like it takes, I don't know, a legal document of 300 pages and extracts the most important aspects out of it to create an executive summary, for instance. I imagine if this is like an important document that is being generated, then you would ideally put a human in the loop, but then ultimately that person would have to sign off that the summary is correct. And I imagine that might be fine to do it in the first 3, 4, 5 cases, but after a while, if you discover that actually the robot is making fairly accurate summaries, you will get probably a bit bored by doing all of that sign off work. And I guess the human in the loop would not be that efficient anymore. I mean, it's a bit of a cartoon, of course, but how do you think about putting effective human in the loop strategies up?
Good question. So, and I would um, reuse my simple analogy from a few minutes ago, electricity. So if you're responsible for ensuring safety of your electric circuits, that specialist, that subject matter expert, doesn't use their bare hands to check if there is electricity current in the cabling. They use tools, and the same would apply for your scenario that you just described. So we have seen an introduction of new example of Gen AI models, which are called constitutional AI. And essentially, these are AI algorithms that have some of those controls embedded as part of their design. And these would be the tools that I would expect those humans in the kind of human in the loop to utilize, which makes a lot of sense because, to your point earlier, given kind of the volume of some of the decisions made by Gen AI systems, it's not practical to utilize manual effort when it comes to validating and checking the output. And that's where some of those tools, such as constitutional AI algorithms, would be quite beneficial. And clearly, you would have, again, human oversight, kind of human touch involved in effectively kind of validation that your Gen AI system works as expected through those tool sets. But I agree with you. It's not practical to expect someone to manually review every single response that Gen AI would produce.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's a very good point that probably the humans in the loop will also have to use tools in order to be efficient, and they will be a bit like the machine operators in a power plant, for instance. I imagine.
That's a good way of putting it.
Okay, as we are almost at the end of our webinar, maybe one last question for you, Giles. So you have been working in these large organizations which already had a huge amount of expertise in model risk management, probably also in AI risk management as well. But suppose that you would have to advise let's say, slightly more younger firm who's building their first AI use case. What would you advise? How should they get started in order to avoid the obvious risks and the obvious pitfalls that you have seen over the years?
That's a good question. So first of all, I think before any work in AI starts in those organizations, I think we need to have a clear decision why we're doing this work, right? So we need to clearly define objectives and success criteria. I've seen many times in the past where some of the AI work is done for the sake of doing AI work, right? And then you have this vanity project trap where you have people developing something and then they start looking for applications. So it's your kind of hammer looking for nails scenario. So clearly that's something which is not desirable. If an objective is to increase the overall skill set profile of your individuals and become aware of AI risks and challenges, and as well as kind of technical capabilities, absolutely, it seems like a viable and meaningful objective. But I guess the point here is that an organization needs to decide why they're doing it in the first instance. So that's one thing. Second thing is clearly a balance needs to be struck between innovation and some of those risks that innovation naturally brings about. And that's where it's extremely important to engage with risk functions as well as IT functions and legal functions, et cetera, to effectively create those sandboxes and kind of safe environments that will facilitate safe experimentation. So, for example, if AI projects are brand new to a particular organization, there should be an environment for teams to explore those opportunities and innovate. This is really important. And also those sandboxes would help inform some of the day-to-day decisions that ultimately will need to get embedded into your model risk management controls and IT controls and cyber risk controls, et cetera, et cetera. So that's almost kind of people learning by doing becomes a really important aspect of this. And also, I would argue that shortly after that experimentation starts, once you've had this kind of safe environment, playpens developed, I suggest people start thinking about how to deploy AI in production if successful. Again, I've seen many examples in the past where there were very successful AI experiments with clearly defined objectives and success criteria, all of which were met. And then these projects would disappear because teams would struggle to deploy them. Clearly, as part of deployment and production, MRM and preventive controls and all these things become really important. But also more technical topics such as, what environment do I run this in? Whether it's on-prem or cloud, how do I feed the data? How do I ensure that the data stream is maintained? How do I avoid some of the biases, etc.? So that becomes a really important kind of go live slash kind of production consideration. And also the thought process around deployment becomes again a really important part of your kind of lessons learned and kind of experience gathering. Because if, for example, at the end there is a recognition that there is no way we can deploy this in production, one can argue, why to spend firm resources to pursue that use case in the first instance? And again, that's something that absolutely has to be done at the outset. But if all these steps are there, I would expect organizations to do really well when it comes to go live.
Thanks a lot, Giles, for this nice overview of where you see model risk management evolve. We spent quite a bit of time on AI and generative AI and how to risk manage this. And it's a fair assumption, I would say, that indeed AI will play an important role in the next decade or so when it comes to model risk management. But as we know, forecasting is a very hard problem. So let's maybe do another webinar in 5 years or so and see how much of this was actually played out as we thought, because backtesting is an important aspect of model risk management as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
That's,
thanks a lot.
thanks, Jos.
Thanks, Giles, and
It was a
thanks
pleasure.
everyone for joining this webinar. We hope to see you again next time.